Welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to get to know oneself. With me is my co-host, Alfi.
Hey everyone, and it's good to be back with you.
Today we have a very special episode planned to celebrate my 42nd birthday. Some of you nerds out there will maybe be aware of how the number 42 holds some special importance in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So for those of you who have not read the book just follows this ordinary guy as he embarks on a journey across the universe. And the number 42 plays this kind of pivotal role because it's revealed as the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And it's provided by this supercomputer that has been working on that question for millions of years. So the actual answer is left completely unknown in the book. Like 42 is the only answer that you get, which kind of leads to this like humorous exploration of absurdity and kind of seeking meaning in this chaotic universe. But that's kind of where the book ends. And the fan interpretation, I guess, starts to begin. So since the book's publication, many of us nerds have posited that the answer 42 is actually being read upside down. And that Deep Thoughts, the supercomputer, that's its way of saying that the meaning of life is to be. So if you put 42 in digital text upside down, it is to be. So in anticipation of my 42nd birthday, I decided to write a list of 42 things that I needed to turn upside down in order to be. So I'm going to admit that list got really heavy. It is a culmination of therapy and peership and 12-step recovery work and self-help content that I've been consuming for decades as I continue to heal from a lifetime of addiction and codependence and mental illness. Alfie and I actually considered reading the entire list in this episode as our eyes widened and his neck tired from vigorous nodding. But we tried to do the first 10, and it was basically just me saying a thing and him making some sort of confirming noise, and then me saying some sort of expletive to indicate how big those words meant in my life. So we decided it was not a good listen after about 5 or so. So instead, we decided to pick 7 that really told the story of what I've learned about being a human. And there's a few that I've picked. There's a few that Alfie has picked. And so, yeah, we're just going to dig into the 7 and see what it takes to be. Alfie, you ready?
I am. And so, we both had access to the list and we kind of selected some of the ones that would be representative. I think both of our relationship that has developed over the just over a year and a bit, but also representative of the rest of the list. And, one of the ones that immediately came to mind for me, I think it was a good place to start, especially because it encapsulates a significant part of, our peership. And so the first one is you, in caps, can do hard things. And, that one specifically throws my mind back to a specific period in time. It was right after, around the time after we completed the first round of the Making Sense of Yourself program. We kind of had just finished working with the students and we were sort of thinking about what would happen next. And, one of the things that we had been thinking about is, you had all of these different options of things that you could possibly do ahead of you. And, you kind of at the stage where you wanted to decide what would be the next mountain to tackle. And this one for me was really interesting because I remember there was a moment where you're considering trying to do something else which would have been a little bit closer to doing what you knew already worked or trying something absolutely new. And, I think that the fact that almost went in the other direction is testament to that growth, because I can remember you saying you've already established a process that works, something that is relatively achievable. And then I remember asking you okay, this is good and we know that we can take this direction. But if you were to really challenge yourself and ask yourself what you would hope for in the secret moments when there is no one there to see, what is it that you would want to do? And that, at least from my recollection, was the first time you started sharing this idea of what the club is looking like today. And I'd love to hear a little bit of some of your thoughts on that moment specifically, But maybe also some of the things that encouraged you to put this on your list of 42 killer lessons.
It's amazing that we start here because, to be honest, this was number 42. This was the last one that was put on the list. And the reason was because I really respect the provenance of the quote that it came from. So the quote that it came from is actually, "We can do hard things." And it's such a powerful quote. It's become a podcast. Glennon Doyle and her sister and wife run this podcast called "We Can Do Hard Things." And it's become kind of like this moniker for a lot of people, myself included, about, you know, just how much it takes to be a human being. But my inclusion of it on my list, and you pointed out at the beginning that the word "you" is all in caps. The reason that Glennon talks about that quote is because she had to realize that she was in community, making sense of things and doing hard things with other people, and that it was part of this unique human fabric where everybody's sort of like in it together. But my lesson was actually that I needed to trust myself, that I could do hard things, because I was actually really comfortable in the fabric of everyone. It was the stepping out of that and saying, I'm going to do something different. So I think it's really interesting that you attach that quote to that moment, because I've actually I almost have erased that part of the story, because I was telling somebody the other day that the club kind of came out of nowhere, but when I look back, it was there the whole time in terms of an idea. And what you're saying is highlighting a moment that I kind of forgot, which is there was another idea. There was another way that I was going to spend this year, and I had it all sketched out. And this is not it, listener. Spoiler alert, that's not what I did. I started the membership club instead. And yeah, I do remember that conversation with you. And I also remember feeling so scared that I was making the wrong choice, because I was making the harder choice. You're right. I did know how to do the thing that I had sketched out. That's why I sketched it out. I was like, oh, I could do this. I've done this. Now I can really do this. But starting a membership club is something I've never done. And kind of putting the pedal to the metal in terms of my community-oriented values and being the change I want to see, specifically in my industry, but also in the world, that was the harder thing. So yeah, it turns out I can do hard things. So yeah, and thank you, Glennon, for bringing that language into my life. I have literally signed off my journal every day for probably 4 years now with "You can do hard things." It's my sign off. It's I'm writing a letter to myself, and at the end it's "You can do hard things." And sometimes I can write it without crying, and those are better days. Yeah.
Yes. But I think that what is so good, I would especially say, it becomes more, the more options and autonomy you have, the more important that level of understanding becomes, because in a sense, it becomes easier and easier and more tempting, kind of just do the things that you know how to do and the things that don't really challenge you, especially if you have kind of, either made a name for yourself or become really good in a specific domain or skill set. It's tempting to sort of just continuously lean into that and do the things where failure is relatively out of the realm of reason. But in a sense, it's where growth starts to decline. And so it's important to be able to say that to yourself, both when things are starting off, but also when things are difficult, because, there is you can almost interpret that in two different ways. On the one hand, you can think about it from the perspective of you can do hard things so that you choose the path that is not necessarily take the easiest path, right? Almost thinking about it at the beginning of the journey. But at the same time, it also has a whole different meaning when you're going through something difficult and you're feeling like you want to give up, remembering the fact that there have been many other difficult things that you have faced and overcome in the past, and this can just be one of them, or you could take the decision to sort of give up. And so I think, there are two sort of avenues of benefit for considering that theme.
Yeah, because even though, taking this road in this particular example was the harder one, this is not the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I have done much harder things. But because I've done those much harder things, I can make decisions about how much I can trust myself to do something that is outside of my current comfort zone or my current skill set. So, yeah, I'm glad we started there. Oh, the next one, though, Alfie, is... She's not so sunny, this next one. Okay, so the first one that I chose to focus on is this idea that people-pleasing is selfish and not selfless. And I feel like I would assume that some listeners are hearing that and going, yeah, duh. So I'm only talking to the people pleasers or the former pleasers right now. And I know that, and that's all right. But what I have to say is that I spent far too much time in my life believing that pleasing other people was a selfless thing to do. And I would hide my own truth, my own authenticity. I would pretend to be things I wasn't for just to make people happy. And I only realized in the last few years how selfish a choice that is. That it is selfish to hide what you really believe, especially from somebody that you say that you love. And I think that people pleasing, when you're a people pleaser, it doesn't like stop at work or stop at home. It's like, it's both, it's all. And yeah, I think that it's a real poison in a lot of relationships. And for me personally, my discovery of this came through my work in healing codependence and understanding that there is a huge difference between being nice and true kindness. And while true kindness is one of my stated values, being nice is one of the ugliest traits that I ever see in myself. When I'm purely saying something to be nice to another person, that is one of the worst versions of me. And I see now how I used to see that as a selfless person who was protecting another person from my reality. Yeah.
So I just kind of want to try to bring a little bit of clarity, because I think the distinction between being kind and being nice may be obvious to somebody who has considered them pretty deeply. But I think on the surface, they can kind of sound like synonyms for the same thing. So I don't know if you want to maybe give a little bit of clarity around how you distinguish them.
Yeah. I love the example of somebody has spinach in their teeth. Okay. The nice thing to do is to not say anything because you don't want to embarrass them, and they might be embarrassed if they realize there's spinach in their teeth. Now, they're going to realize there was spinach in their teeth at some point. Either someone is going to be kind enough to say the uncomfortable thing to them to make sure that that doesn't become a permanent part of their day, or they're going to be in private and they're going to discover it themselves. In both of those cases, they didn't get the information when it would have been available to them if somebody wasn't so afraid of hurting their feelings that they decided to just be nice. And so there's something about this, like, niceness is protective of the other person. Niceness is saying the thing you're supposed to say. Like when somebody says, "How are you today?" and you're doing crappy, but you don't really have a relationship with that person, and you say, "Oh, I'm great. How are you?" That's nice, right? That you're not being very kind to yourself or that person. Not letting them in at all. It's a boundary that you're placing. It's a wall. Yeah.
At least from what I'm hearing, the main thing is kind of like, in the one sense, or at least the way you're posing it, is like being nice is kind of valuing short-term comfortableness or cordiality at the expense of their future benefit or future gain, while being kind takes a longer term view of their benefit or well-being, and considers the fact that sometimes, something that is a little bit less comfortable up front has got an overall benefit in the long term.
Yeah, exactly. And that applies to us too. Like, I can be nice to myself, but that's not often good for me, right? Like, if I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be nice to myself and let myself drink 14 iced coffees because I'm feeling stressed out, like, I can guarantee you that is not a kindness to my body, but it feels really good in that moment, And I feel like that's, it's not just about other people. Like, we can be people pleasing ourselves, and that is also a deeply selfish thing to do. Because it puts the focus in the wrong place, I think. The focus is in protection instead of connection, and I think that might be a part of it. Yeah.
100%. And, you know, I almost get the sense that the next one, you know, the one that I selected off our list is in some sense a bit of an illustration of that. And, you know, this one actually resonated with me on quite a personal level. So maybe before I go into my rabbit hole, I'll kind of give it to you verbatim, and then maybe talk a little bit about what inspired me about this. I am not my thoughts. I am the thinker of my thoughts. Now, though I'll maybe sort of leave it to you to share a little bit about some of the initial inspiration from the specific item. But one of the things I think that really resonated with me about this is, especially when it comes to breaking bad habits and sometimes even addictions, whether they be, you know, simple things or intense ones. One of the biggest hooks, I guess, that an addiction can have in you, that you start to believe specific stories that you've told yourself every time that you've kind of maybe fallen or made a little bit of a slip up. Like there's this story, either it's like, you know, I'm not the kind of person who, or, you know, I couldn't be, and there are these narratives that kind of play in the back of your mind until they've played so many times that you almost can't imagine a reality in which those are not true. And it is almost impossible to make progress until you have gotten to the stage where you can separate yourself from that narrative. And whether it's a thing of, I'm a morning person, or I mean, I'm not a morning person and I'm a night owl, is like, until you entertain the possibility that you could be something else, it's just never going to change. Because deep in the back of your mind, you're always going to be telling yourself, even though I maybe woke up on time today, this is just temporary, and eventually I'm going to not be able to do it. I'm not going to go back to waking up at 10 a.m. And fall back into those old habits. And it requires you to, in some sense, have trust in the fact that though you may be a certain way right now, that can change. And for you to be able to do that, you kind of have to be able to make that distinction between your thoughts and being the agent that contains the thoughts. And I would say that it's almost something that you can't really fathom until you've gone through that shift from one side to the other. And so I think it absolutely struck a chord with me. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and maybe you can also share some of the initial inspiration around that one.
I do have some thoughts, but I am not those thoughts. I am purely the thinker of those thoughts that I have. So first, I want to give credit where this quote came from, because this is a direct quote from a book called The Untethered Soul. It's by an author named Michael Singer. I highly recommend this book. This book was definitely like a life changer. It's a life changer for many people. So definitely a huge shout out to that author. I think for me, this was also something that came about through like mindfulness practice and looking into meditation. It's like this idea, I remember when I was the first time I meditated, I did like one of those apps where they have the little cartoons and they kind of explain the concepts. And one of the most powerful concepts was this idea that there's always blue sky above the clouds, and that the clouds are purely like this momentary thing that's blowing through. And the clouds are your thoughts. And the blue sky, that's your mind. That's like the whole space. And so it kind of started for me there, this idea that like, oh, thoughts are like clouds and they just pass by. And then also like relating those to emotions. Like I recently learned the difference between an emotion and a feeling, and it kind of blew my mind. An emotion is like a response to a stimuli, right? And like, you know, something that triggers anger for you could be different than what triggers anger for me. So it's like, it's purely a response to a stimuli. But a feeling is the story we tell ourselves about our response to that stimuli. So the labels that we put on it, the background that we give it, the texture, the length of time and energy that we give towards it, that's the feeling of that emotion. And emotions pass in 90 seconds. That's another thing I've learned, and that's crazy. But feelings They do not. We're we're sort of in a self-serve place with those. So yeah, I think like thinking about your mind or my mind as this vast array of passing thoughts that I'm just observing. Like I'm just there. I'm just laying in the grass looking up at the clouds as they pass. And that some of them I might be like, wow, I really want to like watch that one until it disappears into the horizon. And other ones I might just be like, I don't even want to acknowledge that that thought exists. And it doesn't matter because it's like they're all just clouds in the sky. There's no time to acknowledge all the clouds in the sky. And like I feel similarly about thoughts. There's no time to acknowledge all of the thoughts in my brain. So why try? So I don't know. I feel like that has become a really important part of my self-care is to just, when I'm thinking something crazy, to remember that I am purely the thinker and that it is the thought that is crazy. It is not me. And that's been really relieving that like, yeah, anyone can have crazy thoughts. Everyone does have crazy thoughts. It's what we do from the story that we make up about it. It's the attachment that we develop to the sheen of having had the thought. Like it's those things that we take with us.
Exactly. And maybe one thing I would touch on before we move forward is especially the last aspect that you're talking about is like if you consider your thoughts to be fully you, in a sense you would then be culpable for the things that you think. But if you consider the fact that you don't generate your thoughts, granted you can actively recall things and that brings a thought to your mind and has a chain of other considerations that might come from that. But at the same time, there are many thoughts that in some sense spontaneously show up in your mind. And if you're unable to make that distinction, or if the world was in such a way that you were your thoughts, you would actually then be culpable for everything that you think, the good things and the bad specifically. But I don't believe that to be the case, which is why I think it is a good and kind thing to remember, especially when you're having not so great thoughts, that you are not entirely in control of them. And it is your response to those that is actually what is important and what you can be held responsible for.
Yes. Yeah, because if you spend all of your emotional energy trying to not think that, instead of dealing with the fact that you are thinking that, it's a world of difference in terms of the healing that you can see, for sure. Yeah.
Hundreds.
I could pop off about this one. I'm just going to make that very clear. So this is actually a culmination of 2 on the list, and they were separated by about 20. So it was interesting that both of them came up, but that I ended up kind of smushing them for this purpose because I just think they're so related. So the 2 are the word should often holds our insecurity and our fears about ourselves. And then the other one is judgment is an expression of traumatic should. Okay, so let's talk about should. I have been obsessed with the word should for the last, I would say, 10 years, mostly because it feels like anytime someone says it, it has judgment. It has self-judgment in it when it's about themselves, like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have not stayed up so late last night. But it also is in judgment of others, like, oh, they shouldn't have done that. Like, that shouldn't have been what happened. And I feel like we're kind of caught in a world where there's so many traumatic levels of should, like societally placed should storms. And I just think that it's something that we have to be really aware of, because otherwise we're like pointing those should storms right at ourselves. And I do that all the time. Like I get lost in this like shoulda, coulda, woulda of everything. And if you're not careful, that really does become like the story that you tell yourself, is that you didn't and you could have. But that's not often the truest story. The truest story is usually that there's reasons that should didn't come through into a did. And so, yeah, I think like on one side, it's like when we say should, I know anytime I say it, I immediately think, what is the insecurity or fear that I am putting into this, if it's about me. And if it's about somebody else, I ask, what is the judgment? Like, what judgment am I placing on this person by saying should? And I think that it's one of those really dangerous, thrown about words.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I have to say immediately with this one, I feel like I have a little bit of a different relationship with it. For two reasons. On the one hand, the thing that immediately comes to mind is sort of relating this back to the previous point, is sort of like the thinker and the thoughts. And I get the sense that should is the thought, not the thinker. It's sort of like you're not entirely in control of what you feel like should be the case. In a sense, should is almost like this is the way things are supposed to be, but aren't for some or other reason. And so I've kind of always had this sense that the should isn't always correct, but it does say something about and maybe at times it points to an assumption that I have which isn't true. At times it points to an expectation I have of someone else or myself that isn't panning out to be the case. But I think one of the things that I would say, and I'd almost relate it back to the question of people pleasing, is I think, especially because I would say the first half of my life was a little bit of a struggle. I kind of had to wrestle with the shoulds from really, really early on. From I should be at this specific level in terms of reading, or I should be at this level academically, and kind of eventually just coming to the stage where I'm like, I'm not. We have to deal with that. And I'm not gonna be, because we've tried and it's not working. And so from early on, I kind of had to figure out a way to turn the should into a story which gives me agency. Because I think the problem with shoulds, especially when they haven't been interrogated, is they can very easily remove your agency. Because sometimes you expect something of yourself which on the surface level makes sense, but after having explored it in a little bit more depth, it becomes clear that there is a reason it isn't that way. And I think it's getting to the bottom of it and getting to that reason, which is much more important. So I would say, at least at this stage of things, I find, well, this is not always the case, because I think new shoulds can still throw you for a little bit of a loop, especially when it's not something you've considered before. But more often than not, I think of it more as a pointer towards something else rather than a critique of myself. But then I would also say I've somewhat gotten used to being the off the beaten path type of story.
Sure.
And that's full of shoulds that didn't turn out.
Yeah, no, I think that like one of the more interesting things I've thought about with the word should is, if we can't say that, what can we say? Because it's a word that comes up all the time. And I posited a couple years ago in a talk that I gave that if we could reframe should but into could if, that we can get that kind of agency that you're talking about. And I really think that it's one of the most powerful words or important type of revelations I've ever experienced, where I'm like, man, if every time I can think about should and then I can twist it to what the could, like the most true could statement is, then I can follow it up with the if. Like, what are the conditions that would need to be in place for that to actually be possible? You know, like with your example, like I should be farther along in reading. It's like, maybe I could be further along in my education if this society did not place such a reliance on one form of learning style, right? That's a completely different story that you're telling yourself about yourself. And so, yeah, I just think that like the idea of the possibility of could and the healing of if can be really full against them.
100%. Yeah, I think it's interesting how as we're going through this, the relationship between the seven is kind of becoming a little bit clearer. This next one, I think, is also an interesting consideration. Holding boundaries can save your life. Now, that maybe sounds a little bit dramatic, but I don't entirely think so. Now, I would say it very much depends on the boundary in question. But I think one of the things that really spoke to me about this is the fact that it is one of the things that I've struggled with quite a bit. Now, I think the context in which I'll talk about it might be a little bit different from what initially inspired you. But I think the way I really think about this is in terms of relationships, but specifically building, not only necessarily building and maintaining relationships, but who you choose to have relationships with. Because especially given the fact that I've kind of nurtured the story of the idea that I might take the road less traveled or be somewhat off the beaten path, it kind of leads me to exploring things which are somewhat less than typical, sometimes not so safe, sometimes not so advisable. And especially going into things, you can have this idea that, a lot of people don't take this route, but I'm going to be okay. And like, I've thought this through. I'm going in with both eyes open. Yeah. But I think one of the things I've somewhat had to learn the hard way is you may have both eyes open when you're going in, but that doesn't mean you will have both eyes open all the time. And so you may be knowingly taking on a risk, but over time, your awareness can shift. Now, maybe to not be talking in too much in abstracts. The main thing I'm thinking about is, for example, I'm extremely extroverted. I like to make new friends. I like to hang out with people, and even if we don't necessarily share the same values and so on. And especially coming in knowing the fact that you don't necessarily share the same values, I kind of come in with this perspective is like, I know where my values lie, and I know that our values are different. But the thing to be aware of is values have got a sense of osmosis to them if you're not very careful. And things that you knowingly wouldn't do at the beginning can somewhat slip in if you're not careful. And so I would say the reason why it is important to be clear about boundaries and what it looks like when things go too far is you won't always be aware of the fact that you are changing in some kind of way, or this person is having an influence on you that isn't entirely visible to you. And so I think the thing that, to me, that I've learned with boundaries and why I think this is important is because some of the hardest periods of my life have been brought about by hanging out with people who I probably shouldn't. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think sort of having the wisdom of hindsight, I think I am a lot more intentional now about the relationships that I build and the role that those relationships play in my life. So those are at least my thoughts on that one specifically. I'd love to hear what kind of brought this into your mind initially.
Oh my gosh. If there was like a theme of my life of the last 5 years, it would be boundaries. It would absolutely be boundaries. Like from family to friendships to politics to work, like the word boundaries has just come up again and again. And there's this, I'm gonna do an old Seinfeld reference because I just think it's like the perfect metaphor here. But on the show Seinfeld, there's this scene where he went to go rent a car and he made the reservation. But when he gets there, they don't have a car for him. And he goes on this whole thing about how, like, that's the whole point of the reservation, is that you make the reservation. And it's not hard to take the reservation. It's hard to hold the reservation. And I feel similarly about boundaries. Like, I love that you related it to values, because I think that in a lot of ways, when we state values, we're basically setting our boundaries around what we will and will not engage in, what we might or might not tolerate from other people. Like, it's kind of like the rough sketches of boundaries. But as we come upon individual circumstances and very specific contexts where those values are challenged, where those boundaries are challenged, it's our ability to hold the boundary that can save our life, right? Having it doesn't actually matter. Having a boundary or stating a boundary or saying that that's how you feel about the boundary, like none of that matters until it is put to the test. And the test does not happen until you get there and you have to hold the boundary. And I'll definitely relate that back to people pleasing, because I'll tell you right now, one of the reasons it saved my life is because there are people that will not want you to change anything about what it is you currently do. And when you start having to change those things to save yourself, you will have to set boundaries and then hold those boundaries to protect that work. And so when I say holding boundaries can save your life, I am being very literal. I am being very literal in saying that when I was not holding my boundaries, when my people pleasing and my codependence and my addiction was running my life was in danger. And I am lucky to have made it through that. And holding boundaries is the way that happened. Me not spending time with people that are bad for me, no matter what they said about me as a result. Me choosing to not have relationships with family members that are deeply toxic and hurtful and are not ready to heal themselves. Like, those were all things that were deeply impacting my ability to heal and were impacting my life incredibly negatively. And it was only in continuing to hold those boundaries. Like, I love the phrasing of this because I'm writing to myself and I'm saying holding boundaries can save your life. This is not a past tense. This is a present tense. This is a always, for your entire life going forward. Holding boundaries can save your life. And yeah, I really believe that. I think when I've let my boundaries slide, I see my values slide with it. And you can only so many of those slides before you're in a completely different territory. You're nowhere near your values anymore at all. And I think that, like, when we have those moments of dissonance with ourselves, like, that's when those are happening. Like, when we're not those values as boundaries. And so we let it slide too far outside of what we want to see for ourselves. And what is a life if not, if it's all that? I don't want it. I want the one that I pick.
And the one thing that kind of came to mind as you're speaking is like this, there's this idea that breaches of your values happened in significant, climax sort of moments in the story of your life, but they're actually lasted inches. It's like a little bit at a time, and then one day you look at, you're like, the boundary's all the way over there, and I'm like this way past it. So I think that one is
an example. I had this happen to me recently, and it's such a hard example, but I think that it's really important to say it out loud. I had a situation recently where I witnessed someone saying a very racist statement. And I want to believe that I am able to stand up to strangers in circumstances like that and set a new model for what their expectation should be in public. Like, I want to be part of that change. And I couldn't do it. I could not hold that value. Like, it wasn't a person that I know personally. It wasn't a person that I'm going to have multiple contacts with. It's not somebody that I need to, worry about their impact on me. It's purely I don't want my kid to live in a world where he has to hear crap like that. And I would love to be a person that can stand up, but instead I am a person that hurries along. And yeah, that really taught me something about myself. It made me rethink how far along I am in my own healing of that particular. So yeah, it's hard. Boundaries are really hard, especially when you're not feeling safe. I mean, sometimes you can hold a boundary because it's not safe to. Yeah.
No, 100%. And, as you sort of pointed out, you don't always know that the boundary has shifted until reality just drops a truth bomb on you.
Yeah. Oh man, I set that boundary for myself. I remember thinking, oh man, if I ever heard somebody say something like that in front of my kid, I would not let that go. I would have to say something until it happened to me. And I didn't feel like I could say something. I was scared to say something. I was concerned in what might happen if I said something. And yeah, that showed me that is one of the hard things that I have to keep reminding myself that I can eventually do, you know?
Yeah. It is a tough one. It is a tough one.
Well, let's not turn it into a should, right? Like, it's not that I should have. It's that I could have if I had more confidence in my approach. Yeah, I think that that's a truer statement. Like, if I had more confidence in what I would actually say, so instead of it just being like, oh, I would never let that slide, like, what will I actually say? What are the actual words? Let me start saying them in the mirror so that when this happens, it's not something I have to gather strength or think about. It is like oh no, you say that, I say this. You say that, I say this. And I haven't gotten there. So yeah, if we want to turn it into a could if, that is how I would start holding that boundary as opposed to just setting it. Yeah.
Nice. And I mean, what a way to model the could if.
Yeah, that was a good segue. Oh man, you think that segue? Let's talk about the next one. Okay, so this one is going to take us into the Wayback Machine a little bit, but I want to talk about when I became a manager for the very first time. I was in my late 20s and I was working at an agency and I was their only information architect, and I was basically running their starting a UX practice. Like, they wanted to have one, they didn't have one. I was an IA, and so it was sort of like that merging point. And I was really good at my job, I thought. Like, the clients loved me and my work was really like spoken of highly, and I always got things done on time, and like my meetings were really productive, and like everything was really efficient and effective. And then one day I had a really rough meeting with one of my colleagues. It wasn't with the client, but it was enough of a dust up that it affected the client. And my boss came to me and he was like, hey, we've noticed that there is this repeating pattern with you that you're not very good with people. And I was like, well, excuse my language, but fuck that. Why do I have to be good at people? I'm good at my job. I don't have to be good at people. And he was just like, okay, we're going to send you to a program. And I don't remember what the name of this program was, but it was like a week in an office park in Illinois. And I have since referred to it as anger management for the workplace, because that's what it really did seem like. And it was this process of meeting with other people that had been identified as also not being good with people at work, and having these exercises to go through what exactly it would take to be good with people and be good at your job. So coming out of that, I was like, oh man, awesome. I got this. Like, basically I had a list of rules and social norms that I had to follow. And like a good neurodivergent person, I was like, great. This is my list of masking techniques. Thank you so very much. And they gave me a workbook, which I found to be, pleasurable to fill out. But one of the most impactful moments from that workshop was actually before it started. It was, I sat down at a table, random tables of 4, sat down, and this woman and I start talking. And she says, I can't imagine why you're here. You just seem like you're so nice. And I looked at her right in the eye and I said, well, that just proves that you don't know me at all. That was my actual response to a stranger. And then after the first day, I remember I wasn't even the end of the first day. It was like lunchtime the first day. I called my mom from the parking lot and I was like, Mom, I'm an asshole. Did you know that? And she was like, yeah, I'm really glad somebody else told too.
Sheesh.
Yeah, it was. So this is and I apologize if this is like a big trauma dump, but this was a really big turning point for me, because it was the time that I realized that I was really skilled at information architecture tasks. But if I wanted to get past that like mid-level practitioner, if I actually wanted to get into influencing information architectures in a real way, I would have to get good at people. And so I knew that, like, coming out of that event. But that didn't fix it. It wasn't like, oh, like, I kind of was thinking like, okay, I can be good at my job and I can kind of like get better at people. And I did a little bit of that, you know, I kept getting better at my job and I kept getting a little bit better at people. But a lot of the getting better at people was patterns. A lot of it was like, you know, niceness, people pleasing, what I should be doing. And what I've come to realize in the last few years is that you can't be bad at people and be good at your job. And I've twisted that saying around in my head a million times, trying to break it, trying to think of a way that someone could be good at their job and bad at people. And I'm just left completely blank. So I don't think it's me. I don't think it's information. I don't think it's design. I don't think it's user-centered work. I think it is whatever you do, you can't be bad at people and be good at your job. There's just too much. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk on anger management for corporate America.
You know, I think for a lot of people, they might be scratching their head and be like, I don't really relate with what she's saying. But I would say that there is, like, out of every 7 or 8 people, there is one person who, if they're lucky, realizes that they're in that space and they're in the same sort of situation as what you're describing. And if they're unlucky, they haven't had someone who is brave enough to let them know that they're a bit of an asshole. Because the only way that that kind of thing gets propagated and lasts that long is when you are good enough that people are willing to put up with you. But the truth is, nobody wants to be just put up with. It's like, it's essentially saying, we don't like you, but what you can do is important enough that we will tolerate you, and as soon as we no longer need it, you're out the door. Like, nobody wants that. And so I would definitely say that one of the kindest things you can do for a person in that situation, if you have the stones to do it, take them out for a coffee, sit them down in a context that is not at all threatening, and just like let them know that, you know. And I would also say it's not a good idea to do this when you're holding a grudge with someone, because if they at all think that there is an underlying theme or bad blood, it won't be accepted in the way that it's meant. But if you could let them know that people avoid them, people don't want to be around them, like they don't want to have to experience all of this, it'll not only do you a whole bunch of good if you have to keep working them, but it will do them a world of good. And I say this especially because I've had 2 people in my professional career like that. And I think especially because I'm pretty good at kind of like engaging and managing relationships and communicating, I haven't really clashed with those people, but it is sad to watch a person who is so capable do so much, and then, like, as soon as they step out of the room, everyone starts whispering, and they're like, "See what he did?" And I must admit that I have not always had the courage to speak up. But I can remember at my very first job, we had somebody like this. And then one day we just had it out, you know. He was like, it was, I even remember the room we had it in. We kind of had like dry walls on the bottom half of the room, and then glass in the top half. So everyone in the rest of the office can they can't hear exactly what we're saying, but they can see pretty much from your shoulders up. But the glass was misted, so they couldn't see exactly. But it got so heated. And I mean, I was a junior at this time, and I'm essentially in a shouting match with a senior. And The
That was
crazy
exactly what
thing
happened
is,
in this situation. That's exactly what happened to me. I was shouting at somebody that was much more senior than me. They were the senior client manager, and I was just the user experience manager. It's like not the same, and I had no clue that that would be, you know. Mm.
but the thing for me that was crazy was the turning point. So at first we were like on different sides of the thing, going at it, and it was like, I remember realizing he thinks I'm challenging his authority or challenging him. And it came to the point, like the thing that essentially changed the direction of the conversation was like, I essentially told him, is like, I think you're wrong. It's not that I don't like you. It's not that I think your job is easy. I wouldn't want to be in the situation that you're in. But the people around you are not, like, they're walking on eggshells. Nobody wants to address you when there is something wrong. It's like, we want to get along. And it was sort of like in that moment, I could just, like, the tension just broke in the room because it became clear that we're on the same side. There is no reason. There is no reason to be at each other like this. Now, again, it was something that was resolved immediately, but I do think that was the point at which our relationship started to get a lot stronger. I was able to be a little bit more honest. And I think it took time for him to eventually sort of like come to terms with it and take a new direction. But I also have to say that he was definitely put into a role of authority very early in his career. And like I couldn't even blame him all of these years later, and with the knowledge that I have now, because, you know, I'm around the age that he was at that time, and I'm like, that is a lot of responsibility for a, you know,
Yeah.
a late 20-year-old.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for saying that, just because I had never thought about my age in this story. But yeah, I was in my mid-20s when that happened. And I had a lot of responsibility very, very early. And that was very, very impactful. Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is the best gift I have been given in my career is that manager saying that to me. And I think it's really important that I acknowledge that I had managers before that, and those managers had the same experience, and they were nice, and it behooved them to be nice instead of kind, because I kept their projects moving. And to be honest, those environments didn't care if there was toxic people, because everybody was just like in this really hyper-competitive place. So yeah, the two roles that I had before that job, where I finally had a kind enough manager, I think that hurt so much to realize that, like, I wish that had been in my first job, because I realized that, like, there's this breaking point, like, in my career where anyone that worked with me for the first 4 or 5 years has a completely different impression of what I'm like to work with. And I'm not saying that there was like an overnight change as a result of that particular moment or that training, but that was a huge turning point for me in terms of realizing that the wireframes and the controlled vocabularies and the taxonomies were not the thing I needed to get better at. That I actually needed to stop getting better at those things and to focus instead on the other stuff. And yeah, I kind of doubt that either of the people involved in this situation would be listening to this podcast like 17 years later or whatever. But just in case they are, like, John, if you were out there, thank you. Like, thank you for saying the thing. I know that was not the easiest management decision, and I was not very kind to that person back. I made his life very difficult as a result of having this conversation. And I realized in hindsight how much power I had because of how much work was in progress, and they needed me to complete my work because I was the only one that did it. And I was a very specialized worker in a very tough to find people that did that kind of work environment. So he tried to kind of keep me happy. And I realize now how that kindness wasn't returned. So yeah, John, thank you. And I'm sorry. And also, Julie, I am so sorry I yelled at you. That is not my finest moment in a meeting. And yeah, it's all these years later, I realized why I was yelling, and it had nothing to do with her. So yeah, everything to do with me. So you can't be bad at people and good at your job. That's the takeaway.
Maybe even to put an even more positive spin on that is, if you're bad at people, but good enough at your job that people will put up with you, imagine what you could do if you were also good with people.
Yes. Imagine what you could do. Imagine what you could do. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And when I think of how much people and being good at people has become, that has become pivotal in my work, my personal work, like what I have brought to the field is very much around that part of information architecture. I'm not the person that is continually talking about the newest and greatest ways of making controlled vocabularies or knowledge graphs. I am the person who is reminding people that there are people that make information, and that's the only thing that makes it, and that we have to work with people. So yeah, it's kind of like my weakness almost went on to become my second specialty, which I think is, it's one of those meant to be things, I suppose. Also, I think it's funny that you said, you could bring somebody to like a comfortable environment to tell them something like that, because the conference room that I was brought to that day was this little tiny brown conference room, and they called it the womb. And that is where that news was delivered to me, was in the womb. So I was reborn with that knowledge and a ticket to anger management for corporate America, which was, highly recommend.
Subtle.
I think that there is another point here, which is like, you can change. Like, we can do hard things. You can do hard things. I have done that hard thing. Like, I went through the shame and the guilt and the absolute emotional treachery of admitting that is the impact I had on people. And then I committed my life to not having that be the reality for the rest of my life. And so, if you are a person who fears that you are really good at your job, but you're not so good at people, take a look. Because to Alfi's point, think about what you might be able to do.
Yeah, 100%.
It's a good if.
Right.
Good if.
Definitely.
Another good if. Think of what you could do if you were better at people. Mm-hmm. All right. 100%. We got one more. One more. Yeah.
This one, like, right before we started recording, I kind of went through the list, and this one just kind of got me laughing a little, because it is such a strange thing to be so true. But the last one on our list is, the days are long and the weeks are short. Which is, somewhat of a paradox. And if I'm not mistaken, originated from Gretchen Rubin's Happier podcast. But I think why this one really stuck out to me and why I selected it out of the list of 42 is because I am feeling like I'm experiencing this shift a lot more right now, especially once I kind of made a little bit of a shift from the day-to-day work of working at an organization as an employee to approaching things as an independent. The thing that got so crazy is how much can actually get done in a day, but then at the same time, having the week to just speed by is sort of like, you put your thing in the calendar for a month away, and it's like every day feels so long because there is so much to get done, and then tomorrow is that month away that you'd put in your calendar. And, it's still something that continually leaves me scratching my head, but it just makes me laugh because with time, it becomes more and more true. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, what kind of inspired adding this to the list? Because I would say of the ones that we've covered so far, and even of the ones in the longer list, this one to me seems a lot more like an observation, where I think a lot of the others spoke to like an internal or personal change. So I'd love to hear kind of what inspired this initially.
Yeah. Okay. So I've been obsessed with time for probably about the last decade and a half. For whatever reason, I love like the idea of time tracking and figure out where my time goes and like, what do I do with my time? And so I've been kind of like a life logger type of person. Like I have a sketch note of every day of my 30s. That's like one of my proudest accomplishments. And one of the things I realized in doing those exercises around time in my own personal life was that you can slow time down and you can make time more easy to recall by logging certain things about it, at least for me. So by having to draw a sketch note every day of my 30s felt like they went on forever because I had this like commitment that I had to do this little square every single day. And I remember drawing most of those little squares. And so it sort of felt like I could take a handle on the speed because I was literally watching it fill up in front of my face every single day through this like monotonous thing. But it couldn't save me from the days are long. Like it couldn't save me from the fact that every decision that I make about the rest of time has to do with what I do today. And that if I do nothing towards the goals today, then tomorrow will be no different. But if there's too many of those in a row, like your goals start to get farther and farther away. And so, yeah, I feel like realizing that the days are long and that they feel like you have so much time sometimes, not so much after you have a kid, let me tell you, but you feel like you have time. And then you look back at the week, and if you're not careful about the way that you thought about and was intentional about those days, the week is gone. It's like ripped away. And so, yeah, the quote that this comes from is actually, the days are long and the years are short. And that was Gretchen Rubin's quote from the Happier podcast. And I changed it to weeks because to me, that's the element of time that feels like it's being ripped away from me. It doesn't feel like years are being ripped away. It feels like weeks are being ripped away. And I actually wonder if that changes with age. Like if right now we feel like weeks are being ripped away from us because we're like moving into that middle space of life. But maybe as we're moving into that latter half of life, like maybe that's when the years start to feel like they're ripped away. And that's kind of a scary concept. And I don't think that it changed. It's not going to be the weeks are long and the years are short. The days part never changes. I think that's like, to me, that's the gift of this saying is that the days are always long. It's like, the rest of it is just looking back. The rest of it is hindsight. And hindsight is always 2020, as they say. So, yeah, what are you going to do today? Like, I think at the end of the day, this is really a statement about presence. Yeah. What are you going to do today? Yeah. And how many todays are you going to let fall before you realize that you're letting weeks or months or years go by? Yeah.
No, I think that's an important consideration. The other part of this that's also really funny is thinking back to when I was a kid. Back then, it was like the days are long and the days are long. We just haven't even started to think about weeks.
Oh my gosh. If I tell my kid, like he's really into math at time and stuff right now, because he's in kindergarten and that's like his current obsession is like learning how to tell time and minutes and hours and stuff. And if I tell him that he has 2 hours until he has to do something, I might as well told him that he's never doing the thing. Like he's just like 2 hours. Oh my God. Like to me, I could cough and 2 hours has passed. Like,
yeah,
it's interesting that like to kids, it really is. Yeah. The days are long and the days are long. Yeah. I wonder when we lose that, like I remember feeling like the days were really long as a teenager too, especially that like feeling of boredom that I haven't been able to feel in decades. Made it feel like, yeah, the days are long and the days are long.
I would say after being a teenager.
Yeah.
But I would also say it essentially when you start enjoying life. For some people that's like some people
I know,
maybe
I'm like,
I think enjoy teenager.
Some people have happy childhoods, Alfi. Some people have happy childhoods. Hello out there if you had a happy childhood.
Well,
yeah.
Look, I would actually say it's kind of like being a teenager is this weird fog where everything feels like a big deal and everything is a disaster and the smallest of things will change your life. And it's like after you get through that, it's sort of like you get a clear, at least for me, you get a clearer picture of time, and that's where the future starts to become shorter.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just my casual speculations. Who knows?
I love it. This whole podcast is our casual speculation. We could have called this podcast Casual Speculations About Life. Maybe we will.
Yeah. But that was good. That gives us our 7. And who knows, maybe at some point the entire list of 42 will be made available to you listening.
Yeah, no, I actually want to put it out there because I'm interested if anybody's listening to this like all the way through. If you're interested in seeing the list of 42, we typed it up for this episode. Send me an email. I'll send it to you. I'm very proud of my list. I don't know that it's something I need to own in public, like as, a piece of content or anything like that. It's a little bit too personal. And I don't know that I want to be like the person who's having to explain all of those statements and the provenance of all of them. But yeah, if you want to send me an email, abbycovert@gmail.com. I'm very findable. I'd love to share the rest of the list with somebody. So we'll see. I'll let you know in the next episode if anybody emails me.
Amazing. But I think this is now a good time for us to transition to something a little bit more familiar, given that our episode today has been a little bit different. Abby, how made sense of are you this month?
Oh, boy. Yeah. So this is episode 6, which means that we have 6 episodes of me knowing that you're going to ask me that question. And my immediate response is an audible groan. And so I just want to call that out. I don't think we've been editing that out. So Kevin, if you're listening, don't edit that out. I am still living in my car at the train station. And I told you that I wouldn't lie to you about it. And so, listener, I'm also not going to lie to you about it. On the last episode, we talked about burnout. We talked about the metaphor of the burnout train coming through the station and me not getting on the train. But we also talked about the fact that I am still at the train station, living in my car. I think this is where we last were. I am now taking visitors to my car. Like, people have started showing up with baskets of food to try to entice me to leave the car and leave the parking lot. So that's been very nice. I feel like I have a lot of support. And I have no interest in walking back into the train station. Like, I do not want to move towards burnout. But I do find myself in this incredibly busy season of my life where I am working on a few things that I am incredibly excited about and do not want to take my foot off the gas for. But I am finding myself needing to take my foot off of the gas. So I am trying to realize balance while also aggressively pursuing my goals. And so that looks like being more boundaried with myself around my working hours, being more open with other people about my capacity, and working on delegating. Like, I've really been thinking the last month about how do I share the heavy work that I'm doing right now, because I know that many hands can make that light, but I haven't asked for the hands that I know are there. So yeah, I think that's where I am right now, is I'm trying to get to the place where I know who I'm asking for help and what I am asking for and what that will mean for me to eventually, put this car into drive and leave the parking lot, go back to my house. I've been in my house the whole time, but in this metaphor, I live in a car in a parking lot, train station. So, yeah. So, Alfi, how about you? How made sense of are you this month?
Well, look, here's what I would say. I wouldn't say that I'm made sense of, but I've done a lot of sense making. And, I won't go into too much detail, but I spent a little bit of time away from town, away from work, without the digital world at my side for, it was about 4 days. And I think there were a lot of sort of thoughts at the back of my mind, which I kind of pulled out of the attic, brushed off, and examined quite deeply. And I think I'm definitely better for it. It is always a bit of a humbling experience looking at things that you've been avoiding looking at. But at the same time, as always, it is also an extremely freeing experience to be able to say that you have now looked at them and know the size and scope of them. And so I think I'm definitely better off for having done that. I think it's given me a little bit of clarity around what the future might look like for me. But more than that, it's reduced the uncertainty, I think, that I'd been kind of harboring at the back of my mind. That was maybe causing a couple of sleepless nights here and there. Well, I wouldn't say entirely sleepless, just not as much sleep as I would like. And so, I mean, that I think is the main thing from my side. And, now it's kind of just sticking to those resolutions and some of those goals. And seeing how they unfold for me in future. And so I'd say that about how made sense of I am.
We're doing great, everybody. We're doing great. Yeah.
Yeah. So, should we maybe also give everyone listening a little bit of an idea about how things have been going on behind the scenes with the Sense Makers Club and discussions and all of those fun stuff?
Yes, I would love to do that. The Sense Makers Club has been really active this month. I feel like we have had a resurgence of new members. We have a couple of new things on the calendar. So this month we are starting the Making Sense of Change group. We're also having a special event on the 25th that's going to be open to the public on age diversity and sense making, which I am co-hosting with Daphne Foreman. I feel like as we get into the fall, it is Make Sense-Miss time, which is my favorite time here in sense-making land. And so, I just read through all of the applications for submissions for Make Sense-Miss. There was so many amazing applications this year. Like, I am going to have to make this a longer event if you all are going to continue to do this to me, because this was probably the hardest year of deciding. So that event is coming up on November the 1st. And I feel like we're trucking. Also, Alfi, should we give them a little update on what you and I are doing behind the scenes? Just a little. I think so. Just a little. Yeah, just a little. Just a little. Alfi and I, you listener, if you have been paying attention, this whole podcast started because Alfi and I did a cohort-based course called Making Sense of Yourself. And we spun off this podcast to kind of talk about what we learned from teaching that and what we learned from developing the tools together. And that has been super rewarding. We also have gotten the insight that it is really unfair to this kind of work to put it into a cohort that is 12 weeks. It felt like it was trying to fit the world into a box it was not going to fit in. And we just don't think that people's lives necessarily work that way, where you can just like carve off 3 months and make sense of yourself. So we really appreciated the students that let us test the materials, but we think that there is perhaps a better model for that content. So we've been deep in thought land working on that better model for the last few months. And I think we're getting close to being able to tell them something more specific. But for now, something is coming. The winds are changing.
The winds of change are blowing.
Yeah, the biggest headline is we're just trying to make sure that this material is available to as many people as possible without the limitations of us. So, I'm really excited about what we have coming next. And I think by the next episode, we should be able to share a little more.
A little some.
A little more.
And actually, maybe it is also a good time to do a little bit of a head nod to the previous mini episode that we had. Like, I would say it was quite a bit of a surprise. And I'll also maybe let you comment on it briefly. But I think one of the things that's super cool about this is the opportunity to bring more voices into the conversation. This is round 6 with me and you, but I think it's amazing for us to be able to give the rest of the community, both of the podcast and the Sense Makers Club, an idea of what it looks like inside the club. Because there are many people who I think have either heard about it in passing, maybe seen something on LinkedIn or somewhere else about this mysterious club, and so it's amazing for us to be able to put some of the faces behind it out into the world and kind of give them a platform to be able to share what their discussions are about and what some of the questions that they are tackling in their discussion groups.
Yeah, no, I loved the first minisode. I mean, I stacked the deck. Zalihada and Alexis are one of the best examples of two strangers meeting through this process and just like really making waves in terms of the kind of radical community that they are creating for folks. Like, I've just been so continually impressed by those two and their commitment to making sure that this club is really as diverse and inclusive as we say that we are. And I'm so thankful that they were willing to give us their time. I'm also very excited that we're going to be, having more episodes coming out soon. So we're doing them as fast as we can. And I think, we have a couple of subjects coming up that are going to be really cool. So stay tuned. With that, I think we're going to bring it home. The next time that we record a podcast, I will be 42 years old. That is the news of that day. And thank you for listening to this whole thing. If you are still listening, if you are still listening, we would love to hear from you. Hit the follow button or send us an email or a DM or post about our show. We do this just because we really like and enjoy talking about these things, and we want to get this information out there to other people and start the conversation. So we'd love this to become more two-sided as things go and hear more from you all. So if you have topics or things that you wish we had talked about more on this episode based on something that we said, we would love to hear from you. So reach out. And with that, until next time, be clear.